Hello, World History. I am going to fill you in on some information here on transforming nations in the developing world. We're going to do a little bit of economics, a little bit of social stuff. Ultimately, I want you to kind of understand the positive changes that we're seeing happening in African nations today, as well as take a look at some of those difficult issues that they are focusing on. So we're going to be talking about agriculture, as you can see over here, a little bit of education. We've got technology. We're going to be talking about international organizations and just how we've seen people really make some positive change. This book is awesome. You really should read it. And it's called The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. Obviously, you can see that. But it's written by this guy, William Kamkwamba. And he lived in rural Malawi, which was drought-stricken and dealing with famine all the time. And when he was about 13 or 14, he decided he had just had enough of that. And he was going to learn how to make a windmill. He thought that would help bring electricity, consistent form of electricity to his country. So it's his story about how he did this by basically combing through the trash and just grabbing a physics book, which was in English, a language at the time he didn't speak, and teaching himself how to make a windmill. It's pretty amazing. And one of the summer reading options, when you guys get to pick the books, that's one of the ones that we offer, and I help lead the discussion of it. So shameless plug to read that book because it's just really inspiring. All right, so let's get into it here. So a couple of economic terms. OGT loves to ask you about economic terms, guys. I can't stress that enough, so let's break it down. What we're seeing happening in a lot of African nations is that they're in the process of moving from what we call a traditional economy to a market economy. And this is something we've seen all industrialized nations do. I mean, here in the United States, it's hard to imagine a time when we didn't have really a major market economy, but we did have, at least in colonial America, a more traditional economy. So traditional economies are, as you can see, based on traditions, rituals, common ownership of goods. So it means everybody kind of comes together, pulls their resources together, but you don't have as much stuff. There's no Walmarts and Targets in a traditional economy. It really limits the choices for consumers. You basically can buy your shoes from the one guy that makes shoes. And that's it. Those are your options. So it favors real small craftsmen, artisans, farmers. There's no real big businesses there. Market economy is selling goods on the global market. So that means raw materials, which you can turn into other things. Okay, that's what like copper and rubber would be, trying to create industry. So usually if you're in this mode and you're trying to switch to a market economy, just like any entrepreneur, any business, you need to have a startup cost. You need to get money from somewhere. So what we're seeing is a lot of countries that are trying now to become market economies often have to borrow heavily from what's called the global north. So if you look at this map here, it shows what the global north and global south are. Couple of exceptions, as you can see: South Africa, Australia, over here, and New Zealand. So that's kind of what we see as the global north. So global north just means countries that have already industrialized. Global south are countries that are in the process. I would kind of argue that China is pretty darn industrial here, but I think this is an older map that we're seeing. All right. So the green revolution and sustainability. How can nations industrialize but avoid all the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution like we saw in England and America? And that, guys, is the million-dollar question. We talked about negative effects in the Industrial Revolution. You guys did a chart on that. You did some newspaper articles. You did an essay. OGT loves to ask about it. We saw things like child labor, pollution, overcrowding, right? So countries that are going through this are trying to avoid that. So what the Green Revolution is, it's not what it really sounds like. I think it sounds like conservation to us here in America. That's not really what we're talking about here. What it means is new farming methods with new tools, new machinery. That is really, first off, the machines are often expensive. And second off, that's going to replace the job of a person that used to do that by hand. Remember, we talked about this with the Industrial Revolution. It's going to make some jobs obsolete. So if you're a farmer and you can't afford some of these new farming methods and these new tools, well, then you lose your job and you're going to start moving to the cities. And so that's where we start to see overcrowding becoming an issue. Here's a great example of overcrowding, obstacles blocking development in African nations. Well, you've got rising populations. You also have a concentration of people moving to the cities. So here, for instance, is Lagos, Nigeria, the fastest growing city in the world. This is also a scene from Lagos, Nigeria. I mean, like, how are you even supposed to drive here? I'm not really sure. Very, 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 very densely populated. Right now, it's the third largest city in the world, and that just puts a lot of pressure on the governments to provide services for these people. You got to make sure everybody has access to water. You got to somehow make sure there's schools in place. You have to have health care. child labor is a huge problem in most of these countries. They just don't have the laws yet in place to stop a lot of that stuff. And then the other thing is if a country is dependent on one crop or dependent on foreign loans, it makes your country really vulnerable. Because if something happens to the international market, like it did in 2007 and 2008, and you depend on foreign loans, you're in trouble, right? Or if your entire economy is based on one crop, and something happens to that crop, and nobody wants it anymore, you're in big trouble too. So these are things that are kind of holding back some of these countries as they're trying really to get to development. Other issues and changes just facing a lot of African nations. A lot of countries are really, really lacking women's rights. And I kind of make the argument that I believe women's rights are really crucial for a lot of reasons. If women have the right to, for instance, say no to a man, and in a lot of countries, guys, they don't. And if they do, it's going to limit the amount of births that are going to happen. It's going to slow down that population growth. It's also going to be able to keep that healthcare a little more affordable. There's going to be more access to it. It's going to make education a little bit easier. So more girls will be able to go to school. They'll be able to enter the workforce. And it's just something that I think is crucial, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but really all around the world. Religious fundamentalism can block the road to peace. And this we're seeing, we talked about yesterday in class, what's happening in Nigeria right now with this Boko Haram and the kidnapping of these girls. We've got religious fundamentalists that are obviously causing some horrible things to happen, and it just makes it difficult to have peace. And then shanty towns, which is on your study guide, this is when the cities are just growing too fast and they can't keep up. They don't have enough resources. And so this is where people are forced to live in some pretty awful conditions. It's worth mentioning that our own country in the Great Depression struggled with a lot of this too. We had shanty towns springing up all over the United States. So we're not immune from this, but this is something that people in a lot of sub-Saharan African nations live with every day. So these are some things that are definitely standing in the way for peace. So really what it comes down to is countries and individuals are forced to make some pretty tough choices. First off, countries kind of say, do we want to go the route of socialism or do we want to go the route of more capitalism? Socialism really kind of, a lot of people that advocate that in sub-Saharan Africa say, well, it'll help get the foreigners out. We don't have to depend upon them as much. We can sort of make sure everybody in our country has a role and is doing that role. The downfall of this, of course, it's very inefficient at times. We've seen that in other socialist countries in world history. It tries to bridge the gap between the rich and poor. Notice I said tries and doesn't actually do. I think socialism, as we've talked about, on paper sounds great, but it's another thing to make it actually work, and we haven't typically seen that throughout world history in all socialist countries. Capitalism is when you've got that free market. So that's going to allow private ownership of property. It's going to encourage business and foreign investment to come into the country, which is both good and bad. You're going to have foreign investment come in, you're going to have business come in, but then some people resent that you're going to have foreigners in control. And a lot of people would rather see, sub-Saharan Africans in control of the businesses. Then you got to decide, do we want to go cash crops or do we want to go food? So cash crops, what's going to make a crop? What's going to make a profit here? Coffee, cotton, things like that. These are things you can't really eat. Well, I guess you can eat coffee, beans. I don't know, that would be kind of weird. I certainly drink a lot of coffee every day, but it's not something you can live off, right? So you rely on your imports for your food. And that also makes you really dependent on one crop, which we said makes you vulnerable. The other thing is, are workers getting a fair wage for these? And so this is where we see, sometimes maybe you've noticed this at home or in the store, you'll see fair trade certified on things like coffee and even fruit, tea. But this means that if you buy something with that fair trade symbol, coffee or chocolate are the two things that I listed here, it's going to cost more for sure. But it means that local, small owned farmers are getting paid a fair wage. So the downfall is that you're going to have to pick up that cost. You're going to pay more for it. But some people say, hey, that's worth it to me. I would rather pay a little bit more and know that I'm kind of supporting a business that's going to help entrepreneurs. Food, obviously, it's going to help feed your nation, but that's not going to make you rich. You're not going to have as much in the treasury. So these are some tough decisions that you have to make, developing nations are making. Natural disasters, disease, and other problems really hit the developing world a lot harder than the developed world. Desertification is when we see drought. I mentioned Malawi being a good example with the boy who harnessed the wind. It puts a huge strain on already scarce resources. And it's just really difficult when a drought strikes to make sure everybody has continued supplies. Urbanization is another thing. Lagos, Nigeria is that great example. how do you keep up with the resources fast enough with the growing population? And then you've got environmental threats. You've got overproduction of crops that's going to deplete the soil. That's going to lead to endangered species. Now you're messing with the food chain, So this is where we see the idea of sustainable development. And Wangari Maathai, who is on your study guide, she's a Kenyan woman, and she really led the drive for sustainable development in African nations. As you can see, she really created something called the Green Belt movement to promote reforestation, meaning, like responsibly using that soil, not just depleting it. We're going to replant things. We're going to rotate crops. Also focused on bringing jobs for women in Kenya and Tanzania. And she is the first African woman, as you can see, to win a Nobel Peace Prize, which is kind of a big deal. So there's a lot of positive things going on. There's definitely a lot of negative things too. And some of you mentioned when we were talking about what do you know about Africa, and I know a couple classes mentioned the AIDS crisis. And so at least I think more people understand today than used to. So that's good. We're making progress there. And it's definitely slowing down, but it's still a huge problem. So you can see here, it's orphaning a lot of children. So what this means is of the orphans in each country, the map shows the percentage of those orphans that are a result of the AIDS crisis. So these countries here, the darker the gray it goes, that means in Botswana, 96% of the orphans in Botswana are a result of the AIDS crisis. They have lost both of their parents to HIV. So it's a huge thing that, again, is orphaning a generation. And percent of adults with HIV/AIDS, this is 2007, so this is a little older, but you can see 15 to 28% are the darkest, reddest countries here. 1 in 4 adults, guys, is living with HIV. This is unreal. How does that happen? What are the roots of the problem? Just a lack of education and prevention programs. For a long time, people and governments were refusing to talk about it. It was social taboo to talk about it or talk about contraception or any of those things. There were rumors circulating in many of these countries that if you had sex with a virgin, then you would be cured of AIDS. Well, you guys probably all know in here that is not how you cure AIDS. That's going to make it worse. So this is another thing where we see the need for women's rights and just education and better access to health care is so important to try to stop epidemics like this. Positive changes. Let's get positive here. Let's talk about some positive things. The cell phone technology has made it so that, and this is, you guys know this, for us, we're way more connected than we ever were through things like Facebook, Twitter, other programs like that. And it's the same for sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see cell phone use is growing. This is 2010, so still a little outdated, but cell phone use is growing. There's more access to towers there. That's going to make it possible for everything to get information out. We talked about the role that social media is playing in this Boko Haram situation going on in Nigeria, and also to start your business, to promote your business, to get people, kind of communicating. Healthcare workers can use this. Education can use social media. So it's something that is really helping, and I think something that's brought a lot of positive change here to sub-Saharan Africa. So I want to talk to you guys tomorrow about the World Bicycle Relief, because last year we did kind of a cool extra credit opportunity / fundraiser, and it was a way to kind of make you guys aware of some ways you can help locally and help people out. So I'm going to save this for tomorrow. And so what I'd like you guys to do now in a second here is to get your book and grab that sheet of Cornell Notes, and let's kind of go through and get some good information on this stuff down so you've got a good solid set of information to get ready for our test. So I'm going to stop it here, and that's it. We'll see you in a bit.